don't think a very website was a big thing then in 1997, and probably it was the BBC who started off this website, going on online first. And he was a development. He was a head of the product development at BBC. Then he played an important role in social media strategic and guidelines of the wider BBC. And I would be very interested to know what you are doing in 1997 with social media. And how you started off. And of course, there was no social media in 1997, but I'd be very interested to hear from you how you started off, because that was perhaps the first experiment in online journalism. Now you know him, but I know him with his from his reports, this digital reports. And I think the Digital India report was launched in India and ACJ last year. That was launched in ACJ, and we hosted that launch.
Right.
Yeah. Then, may I know why there was no report this year? I know you just in the main report in India was India.
I'll talk about that in a minute.
Okay. So that's about it. Nick, the floor is yours.
Great. Thanks very much. And really good to be with you. So the Reuters Institute for the Study of Journalism, which is where I'm currently working and doing research. For people who don't know, it's part of the University of Oxford, and it carries the name Reuters because Thomson Reuters gives us quite a lot of sort of core funding for it. And one of the things we do is we bring people from all over the world, mid-career journalists, and they spend time with us in Oxford. Unfortunately, that's very difficult at the moment with coronavirus. But the other part of what we do is really what I do, which is the research, which I've been doing since 2010. So for 10 years or so, starting off doing research into social media, and then more recently launching the Digital News Report, which is the largest survey in the world. And I'm going to about news consumption, and I'll talk a little bit about that and some of the other data and research that we've done over the next sort of 40 minutes or so, and then we'll have 20 minutes or so of questions, if that makes sense. So that's interesting. Let's just try that again. Okay, so I'm going to talk firstly about some of the changes in the media environment that we've seen as a result of digital disruption. So the big trends, if you like. I'm going to talk a little bit about coronavirus and what we've seen and the impact on the media, which I think is a real considerable shock and is going to have a huge impact for years to come. I'll talk about the shift in business models within journalism in many countries. I'll talk about trust, misinformation, obviously a really huge issue in India as elsewhere. And then I'll talk a little bit about the role of social media and platforms and how I see that going forward. So those are the sort of the main themes. As I mentioned, the Digital News Report started in 2012 with just 5 countries, and we've expanded that now in 2020 to 40 markets. So that's about 80,000 respondents. And our ambition is to get to half the world's population in the next couple of years. And in doing that, we will be adding a survey in India. We did a trial in 2019, and from 2021 we'll be trying to provide that and integrate it into the main report, essentially. So in terms of the methodology, just a lot of the data I'm going to show is from the Digital News Report, and it's based on an online survey. And online surveys have many advantages, but many disadvantages. So it's a sort of representative sample of 2,000 people who are on the internet. And in some countries, including India, the internet penetration is much lower. So it's actually quite hard to compare directly what's happening in India, for example, with what's happening in the UK, where internet penetration is about 95%. But I think, what we're increasingly trying to do is to compare within markets, but also to provide that regular data over time. So we work with a polling agency, and then we have a whole load of sponsors and supporters, but the work we do is completely independent. As I say, India, we did a trial in 2019, we're going to add again, and I will just include a little bit of the data from our 2019 survey in this presentation. By the way, I can send you these slides, you're welcome to use them. and have access to them if that's useful. So one of the advantages of asking questions every year is you can see changes over time. So you can really see the structural changes to news. And I'm just going to pick out the US because it's a market we kind of all know something about. First of all, just to see what's changed between 2013 and 2020. And, you know, these days in the US, in terms of weekly reach, in terms of the sources of news, online is the main way in which people are accessing news. So that blue line at the top, you can see doesn't change very much. 70% or so are using it for news. And just a few little changes. So you can see Trump being elected in 2017, that huge surge in interest in news across online television. You can see that very clearly. The second line down is really interesting. So if you look at television news, which has really been the dominant way in which politics has been discussed in the US, I mean, just look how that has declined over the years. So again, a bit of a bump when Trump was elected, and maybe we'll see another one during the election this year. But in general, television use is declining. More people are using on-demand media such as Netflix to access entertainment, and that's having a knock-on effect on news. At the same time, during this period, we saw a huge increase in the amount of use of social media. So from 2013, it was 27%, and then it rose around the time of the Trump election to well over 50% who are using social media for news, and that's fallen back or at least stabilized. And then finally, that last pink line, just look at what's happened to print. So print had been falling before, but it's basically halved in the US, and this is a pretty typical picture that we see. So incredibly strong structural changes with print declining, rise of social media, and television starting to decline is what we see. I'm just going to show another country, which is a sort of more newly industrialized country or developing country, which we've been tracking since 2013. So this is Brazil. And we see, I mean, this is, again, this is people who are on the internet. So actually across Brazil, television remains the most important. But within people who are on the internet, you can see that television is starting to become less important. For the first time, more people say they're using social media for news than are using television for news of those people who are online. So this is a real sort of tipping point, and I think we'll see more of that. The same structural change with print newspapers. Print newspapers have halved again in Brazil since 2013. So these are sort of fairly common. It's happening at different paces in different countries, but broadly, these structural changes are deep and they're profound. In terms of India, when we looked at this in 2019, television remains the most popular overall. We know this from other, face-to-face data, but online is very popular, obviously, with younger people and with more affluent elites. And the poll that we did in India was mainly with obviously people who are online, but also people who tend to use online panels tend to be from those more affluent areas. So you need to bear that in mind. But if you look at the sort of young-old split, when we ask people about what their main source of news is, you can see that under 35s, the majority of under 35s, that's the blue, say that it's online, and the majority of over 35s also say actually it's online, but more of them say it's television. So essentially you've got this split going on where older people still prefer the media they grew up with, so print or television. Generally, in most countries we look at, younger people, particularly digital natives, people who grew up with the internet, way prefer online medium because of the convenience, because of the ease of use, and because of the mobile nature of it. So the other big change that we've seen in our data since we started doing this in sort of 2012 is what's happened in terms of the platforms people use to access news, in particular the rise of the smartphone. This chart from the UK just kind of captures those changes over time. So you can see that in 2013, when we asked people how they accessed internet news, the vast majority used a computer. So they would use a desktop or a laptop computer. And you can see how that's changed. So by 2019, the vast majority of people are accessing on a smartphone. And that is even greater in other countries. And this has enormous implications in terms of the kind of content that's produced that works on smaller screens, the formats of news, I think are really going to be shaped increasingly by the format with which people are accessing it, but also the advertising. So the business models are deeply affected by this, because sort of adjacent display advertising in print worked quite well. You were looking at a print article and you had the advert next to it. On a computer, it worked not very well because it was a bit interruptive, but on a desktop, on a smartphone, advertising really doesn't work very well at all. And so it's another factor which is driving different business models going forward, I think. So I can only see a few of you on the screen, but one of the questions we asked is, where do you get your first news of the day? So put up your hands if you've got your cameras on. Put up your hands if you get your first news this morning, if you got it from television. Okay, I can't see any hands. But put up your hands if you got your first news from radio. Put up your hands if you got your first news from the smartphone. Okay, I can see some hands going up now. So broadly, what we find actually, if you ask, thank you, and I've got some lovely Zoom hands going up as well, so this is great. In terms of the first news of the day, actually in the UK, many people still say they get their news from television or radio, but overall, a quarter now say the first thing they do is wake up in the morning, and the first place they see it is the smartphone. So maybe from the notifications they're getting, maybe they're going through social media, but the smartphone is the starting point. And that was 16% in 2016. So it's really growing very fast, this dependence on the smartphone. It's just one indicator of how the smartphones become more important. And for younger people, this is in the UK, I imagine it may be higher in India. 54% of under 35s say the first place they go is the smartphone. So again, that difference in generations in terms of, not only whether they want to be online or using television, but the devices that they're using as well. So in terms of changes over time, what does that look like? What does that feel like? So this is the daily commute in the UK. We have this is the London Underground, and this is how it looked a few years ago. So there was this kind of time for news. There was this moment when you couldn't do much else, and when people sort of briefed themselves as they were going to the office. And here you can see people reading newspapers. So these are free newspapers, but this was just the way it used to be. It's what you used to see. So what does that look like today? So it looks very different. So these smartphones have completely transformed that. What are people doing on those smartphones? So they're, I'll answer my own question. So they're not necessarily reading news. So many of them are watching Netflix, last night's television. Many of them are playing games. Many of them are listening to podcasts. So the competition for attention is huge. There was a time when newspapers were going to be read and when you brief yourself on the day, and now you have all of these other distractions. And this is really, really the challenge for news and journalism today, is how do you get attention, and how do you keep attention, and how do you define quality attention? And in terms of mobiles, I've kind of alluded to this already. India is amongst the mobile countries in the world. So many of developing countries in Africa, India, Latin America, many people started their journeys with the smartphone, and they never had laptops, they never had computers in the first place. And from our 2019 survey, 68% identified smartphones as the main device for online news. So in many ways, you're moving faster in India than in countries like the UK, where we have this sort of legacy infrastructure of computers. So you're sort of jumping ahead straight into that mobile revolution. Again, just a recognition that this is an urban sample and won't take into account the many complexities of India. So just moving on to coronavirus, and I talk about the shock of coronavirus because you have all the disruption that I've already talked about, and then on top of that, you've had this event which is really seismic and is making people rethink their habits, and think differently. News becomes more important, but it also has changed the way in which people consume news. So we did, in addition to the main digital news report, we did another survey this year where we asked people in 6 countries we asked people the same questions in April to understand the change. So how did coronavirus change their habits? And what we initially saw was a huge surge in television. So you quite often see this when you have a big event, is that people have to see it. Television is the place you go. It's still in many ways the most trusted source, and it's where people go when something absolutely enormous happens. And we saw this in the UK, massive increases in television news, but quite temporary, so for a relatively short period of time. And even young people using television news, which is not something that they necessarily do hugely. So television news was up, but we also saw that actually social media was up across all the countries, pretty much the same amount. We saw that radio was up. So the only one that wasn't up was print because of the problems of physical distribution. So this has really had a huge effect on many printed newspapers and accelerated strategies towards closing down print or putting fewer resources into print. So we're already seeing the impact in terms of the strategies of many media companies. In terms of online, this is the BBC News website. And again, you just sort of see essentially the number of daily browsers doubling as the country went into lockdown. And then it has got back down again. So you had this sort of huge peak of interest, and then people are kind of starting to resume their normal lives. But what's interesting is, just as people turn to television because of the trust that television traditionally has had, people turn to the most trusted brands. So the most trusted brands were the most benefited most during this crisis, because it's a matter of life and death. Information really matters. And then finally, the other thing around coronavirus that we've learned is it kind of accelerated a whole load of other digital habits. So we found in our second survey, huge numbers of people using Facebook groups and WhatsApp groups for mutual support. People who previously hadn't used those, we saw the growth of networks like Zoom, again, that people hadn't used. And suddenly, within a very short period of time, they had to learn these new skills, and they're not going to go back. So, I think what we see generally with coronavirus is it's going to accelerate a whole load of digital behaviors, not just around news, but about the way in which we adopt. Many people who've really resisted digital have no choice in lockdowns. And so this is really, I think, going to accelerate digital in lots and lots of different ways. So I've kind of alluded to this paradox already, is that coronavirus has increased the demand for news. So we've never been more interested in news because it really matters. But there is far less money to produce it. So at the same time as the demand has grown, we've seen advertisers pulling out. So many businesses have lost something like 50% of their advertising revenue. And this is really difficult. People want more news, they want better news, but the business model has had this enormous shock to it. And so around the world, you see newspapers cutting back, you see them closing recruitment operations, and it's very hard to see how some of the publications that have been sort of clinging on before coronavirus are going to survive the next few years. And that particularly applies to sort of local news. People are really worried about the future of local news. I talked a little bit before about, the dominant way in which digital journalism has been funded so far has been advertising. And people assumed that that was how things were going to work, that the advertising revenue would be enough to support large newsrooms. And I think very few people believe that now. Not just because of coronavirus, but because the big platforms like Google and Facebook have basically taken most of the growth. They're more effective at delivering audiences at scale, but also targeted audiences than any individual media company can do. And so they're taking most of the growth in the advertising, even before coronavirus. So media companies are thinking, how do we survive going forwards? And the answer really is to rethink the business models. This hasn't happened as much yet in India, but you're starting to see it in countries like India too. Essentially, where in a poll at the beginning of this year, we asked some major CEOs and editors, where they thought the future was in terms of their revenue. And over half said their main focus was going to be reader revenue. So that is a combination of subscription, membership, donations, events, ways in which they can sell services effectively to people directly. And then only 14% thought the future was going to be in advertising. So, or the main revenue was going to be in advertising. So people are really looking at diversified revenue streams. And this is just a quote from somebody from the Financial Times. So reader revenue is growing, has very positive prospects going forward. Advertising revenue remains a major concern. And that's really only been accelerated by coronavirus. So what do we see around the world? The problem is, of course, people have got used to free news. They don't want to pay. And but we have seen some significant change. So we ask a question every year in the digital news report: have you paid for a digital subscription? So are you subscribing to the New York Times or the Guardian of London or the Times of London or whatever it happens to be? And in India too, you're seeing some of the premium publications trying to charge for digital news. And we have in the US, for example, 20% now say that they are paying some kind of subscription or membership, and that's doubled in the last few years. In some countries in the Nordic region, it's up to 40% in Norway who say that. But in countries like the UK, it's only about 7%. In countries like India, just a tiny proportion of people are paying subscriptions of some kind. So this is going to take a long time, but we are in the midst of that change. And you probably know that the New York Times has something like 6 million digital subscribers now, and they have an aim of 10 million digital subscribers around the world in the next few years. But that's not the only model. We're also seeing some really interesting models where people are donating to either individual journalists or to news organizations or to small local organizations. So I think the donation model is really going to become much more important part of the mix, and will help particularly with local news. For example, you can see an example of a UK local newspaper here, funded almost exclusively from contributions. Investigative organizations, really big media companies like Vox now have asked for donations in addition to advertising and other ways in which they get money. And then The Guardian is probably the most famous. It has something like 1 million regular contributors to The Guardian. And at the bottom of every story, it says, if you trust us, give us some money. And they're trying to get more people to give recurring income. So I think this is all part of the reader revenue revolution. To make that happen, media companies need trust. So if you're going to give them money, then you have to feel that the public needs to feel that it's worth paying money for. And a lot of that comes back to, do you trust the news that's within that? And the news here is not very good as a whole. These are averages. So, some media companies have much higher levels of trust than this. But on average, we see trust falling around the world over the last few years. Compared with last year, across all of the countries we look at, only 38% say they trust most news most of the time, slightly higher in people who trust news that they themselves use, and then much lower levels of trust in search and social media. So those distributed environments where, by definition, the context is a bit harder. It's a bit harder. News is more. There's more news that people don't know where the source is and where it comes from and what the provenance of it is. And again, across most of the markets, we've seen declining levels of trust. There's lots of reasons for it, but in many ways, it's not to do with the journalism, it's to do with the polarization of society. So some of the biggest falls that we see have been countries where we've seen declining trust in the politicians, or where you have deep polarization over a specific issue. So obviously Hong Kong, we've seen significant protests. In Chile, you've got the media is seen as being part of the elites, and there's a sort of big discussion about inequality. And there's been lots of protests about that, and people feel the media is on the wrong side of that. So you've seen a big fall in trust. In the UK, we've seen a big fall in trust because of Brexit, because it's such a divisive issue, and people see things in the media that they don't like, and so they say they don't trust the media. So that's the kind of, in India, when we polled this in 2019, trust was somewhere in the middle. So somewhere around 36% say they trust most news most of the time. So not particularly high. This is the point about polarization. So we asked people in the survey, do you identify with one political party or another, or the left or the right? And you can see here that how the Brexit vote really changed that. So after 2017, we've seen a real fall in trust, as we've seen a fall in trust in institutions and politics generally, and particularly on the left. So people who self-identify on the left trust the news a lot less in the UK than they did a year ago, because we had this very divisive election. So some of these things sort of go up and down, some of them, but they're deeply related to what's happening more widely. And related to that is the whole question about, is the media, are the traditional concepts of impartial journalism still going to be appropriate going forward? So if you try and be fair and balanced on an issue that people care passionately about, and start to distrust you, which is kind of what's happened with Brexit or Donald Trump, should you instead just try and be a media company for one side of that divide or another? Should you create more partial news organizations? Obviously, we have this in the US with television, where you have, CNN on one side, you have Fox News on the other. Is that the kind of future we want, or should journalism at least try and be impartial and represent both points of view? So we asked people what they felt about these issues. We haven't asked this question in India, but you broadly see that most people still would like the media to be impartial, to be neutral, to try and show a balanced picture of what's going on. But there is a difference in countries like the US. In countries like the US, there's much higher proportion of people who say they want news that just comes from their point of view, that reinforces their own political standpoint. And that's increased over the last 3 years since we last asked this question in the US. So I think this is a real moment around, what journalism is, around impartiality. Do you agree with this person from the UK that news should be delivered objectively so that they can analyze themselves and come to their own conclusions without being unduly influenced? Or should it just basically reflect what you think already and help you form those opinions and cement those opinions? I think this is one of the key questions. And for me, this is one of the most interesting slides in the digital news report this year, is that young people, and I'd be interested to get your views on this, seem to be less committed to impartial news, seem to be more interested in news that reflects their worldview, whether that's on Black Lives Matter or climate change. They don't want impartial news about these things. They want a news organization that takes a stand. So I'm going to ask you how you feel about that issue going forward. But there does seem to be a generational difference here, which I think will play out over the next few years. Many people think the news media is too negative. So there's a lot of talk about the coronavirus is very depressing, and a lot of news is very depressing. People want hope. Young people in particular want hope. Is the media too negative? People feel worn out by the amount of news, the amount of depressing news. People avoiding the news because it's so depressing. It's the main reason why people avoid the news, is because it's depressing. We seem to have created a product that is not really in line with what people want. People want hope, they want progress, they want ideas and inspiration. They don't just want bad news thrown down their throat. I think this is a challenge. Again, I'd be interested to hear your views about whether you think that journalism is on the right track, or if it is endlessly negative. Does it properly reflect the world around us? Misinformation. So I know this is a big issue in India and across all the countries we look at. Over half of people say that they can't tell the difference, or they find it hard to sort out what is fake and what is true on the internet when it comes to news, which is a pretty worrying statistic. And this year we've asked them who they think is most responsible for this. So, is it Is it activists? Is it politicians? Is it foreign governments? You know, who is responsible for this misinformation? And what we find is that people most blame domestic politicians for essentially spinning the truth and not being sort of fair and balanced in terms of what they put out through social media, but also through their traditional channels. So in most countries, it's the behavior of politicians, but people also to some extent blame activists and ordinary people as well. And some people blame journalists. Of course, in terms of the channels, people blame different channels. So the most concerning platform in terms of false and misleading information is Facebook, followed by messenger apps like WhatsApp, and then Google and YouTube. But we see very significant differences between countries. So in some countries like Brazil, Kenya, Mexico, Spain, and I imagine in India, where WhatsApp is incredibly strong, then probably the main concern is about WhatsApp rather than Facebook. So these are kind of averages about which platform is more concerning. And when we ask this question in terms of usage, we really see very significant uses of WhatsApp in countries like India, compared with countries like the US, for example. So this kind of helps explain why WhatsApp is more of a problem in India, because usage is much higher, but also the way in which it's used is different in India and Brazil. So there's more groups, whereas in the US, only 4% say they use WhatsApp for news, and very few are in groups other than very small private groups with friends and family. So I think this is something we understand not very well, but you understand much better because you're using WhatsApp in a completely different way to the way it's used in the US and the UK. And it helps to explain why WhatsApp is such an issue in countries like India, but is less of an issue in countries like the UK. Just more generally, social media, these are some averages on how things have changed over the last few years. So in general, the big change has been that growth in WhatsApp. So Facebook's been pretty much the same. YouTube's been growing in importance. WhatsApp's gone from 17% to 48% on average, higher in India. And then you've seen the growth of Snapchat, and Instagram is the other huge driver. So Instagram is the fastest growing network for any purpose. And in terms of news, the previous slide is, are you using social networks for any purpose? This is, are you using them for news? And here you see there was the big growth around 2016, and then Facebook have changed their algorithm, so you see less news in the news feed. So that's become slightly less important, but still the biggest on average. And then you can see YouTube and WhatsApp next, and then now Instagram is almost as big as Twitter in terms of its use for news in general. And this is just the comparing India from the work we did in 2019 with a few other countries, and it's just reinforcing that point that WhatsApp is much more important, and messaging applications are much more important than they are in countries like the UK or the US. So just finally, before we get into Q&A, I've given you a huge amount of sort of data, and I've talked about the sort of the changing role of social media. I think one of the big questions is, as social media becomes much more important for finding news, what can media companies do? How can they rebuild relationships and engagement in a way that maybe they had in television and in print? And in this year's report, we look at just a couple of examples of this, and different ways that I think are becoming more important. So one is email newsletters. So this varies between countries, but in country like the US, it's about 21% who say they use email newsletters every week, and half of those say that it's their main source of news. And we've seen publishers really investing very heavily in lots of different sort of niche newsletters and general newsletters. So a key way in which people in the US will get news is through, say, the New York Times Morning Update, which now has 17 million people subscribing to it, so arriving in their inbox every day. And they've sort of created almost like anchors or hosts, senior journalists who now basically curate that email package every morning. So here's the thing you need to know. here's a way in which you can engage with us every day. And part of the aim is to make this more frequent, so to bring people back and to start to relate, to build habit. But I think the other thing is that digital has been very bad at engaging people. There's very little personality behind it. Social media is great for it, but websites are very cold, they're very clinical, and so people don't spend much time on them. And I think what email is helping to do is to bring some personality back to digital, and to bring some of the curation and the editorial curation into it. So I think this is a really significant trend, even though the technology behind email newsletters has been there for a long time. And then the other thing is podcasts, which is kind of similar in that it's a curated editorial package. It's different in that it engages young people much more. So we find that podcasts are growing. It's not niche anymore, certainly not in countries like the US and the UK. So around a third of people are using podcasts regularly, many of them for news. But what's different is the audience. So this is really aiming at younger people, whereas email is something that really works much better with older people. And we also find that people are spending a lot more time. So typically people will listen to 90% of podcasts. This is younger people who they say don't engage with anything at any depth. And people who use podcasts say that it gives them a much deeper understanding. They're really engaging with with issues in a way that they find it hard to do through news websites, for example. So I think podcasts are really interesting. And again, it's part of bringing back that personality. And it's been fascinating to see how during the coronavirus crisis, podcasts have been used by major publishers around the world to create daily podcasts, updates around coronavirus, which have been amongst the most listened to of any podcast anywhere in the world. So these have been really successful. And I think publishers have learned a lot in the last year about how to engage people. So finally, just in terms of summing up some of the things I've talked about in 4 points. So the sort of historic change I talked about, certainly since we've been looking at this, is the way in which the internet has fragmented attention and disrupted traditional habits, whether that's television or print. It's still going on, and it's undermining business models, it's undermining relationships, it's undermining trust. And the relevance of those news brands that traditionally were critical in terms of democracy and in holding powerful people to account, some of that has been undermined by what's gone on in terms of internet disruption. The shock of coronavirus, the sort of reset, is really just another disruption, which is really making publishers think again and read. So it's undermining the ad-based business models, and it's pushing people more towards reader models that are based on trust and are based more on not on doing loads and loads of stories, but doing a few things that are better and more targeted. So the sort of trend is towards higher quality, more engaging content, maybe for more defined groups of people, rather than everything being sort of mass, trying to reach a mass audience, because the business models simply aren't going to support that. And then finally, as part of that trend, I think we're going to see a lot more of the value going back to curated editorial products. So you can't compete with Facebook or Google in terms of aggregating, mass and scale, because the platforms will always win. So from a publisher point of view, it's about really understanding audiences much more deeply, or an audience much more deeply, and then delivering a range of products, which may include apps and websites and email and podcasts, and bringing a bit more personality to it. So you've got that connection, and that connection ultimately is where you'll build sustainable revenue models. So hopefully that was kind of useful and interesting, a bit of an overview of everything I guess we've learned over the last 10 years from the data, but also a little bit from what publishers are doing. And yeah, very interested to hear your comments and takeaways in the Q&A. Thank you. I don't know if you want to ask questions. How should this work, Devidas? Or should I just read something out from the chat?
Yes, I guess there are some questions in the chat box, sir.
Okay, I'll start there, but feel free just to open your microphone and ask a question.
Yeah, Ishan, can you? Yeah, sorry. Ishan, can you start, please?
He has pretty much answered it in his presentation, but I'll still ask.
Hello.
Sorry. So I was asking if the rise in digital consumption includes digital version of print, example, New York Times apps, website, etc., or is it solely about digital websites?
Yeah, no, this is very much about all digital. So we don't distinguish between apps and websites, but the vast majority of people use websites. So we do a bit of work on the importance of the apps. And what we found is it's really, really hard unless you are the number one, like the New York Times or the BBC in the UK. In general, people just prefer to use the web browser in most cases, and only the loyal users, so the most loyal users, will use the app. So we actually did some survey work where we looked at how many, not some survey work, some tracking work. So we looked at under 35s and young people about how many apps people had. And the main app that people had was, the Apple News app, because it was there by default. And very small proportion had actually downloaded, the BBC app or the New York Times app. So if you talk to most publishers, the app is really for loyal users who spend more time. But in terms of our survey, we're trying to basically ask, are you using this across apps, websites, etc., in terms of the numbers? Yeah.
Also, do you believe,
okay, AJ?
Do you believe digital will gain the kind of trust that traditional media holds today in whatever little form it is left in near future? Like, do you believe that digital websites will gain the kind of trust that traditional media holds?
Sorry, I had my volume turned down at the beginning of that. Could you just very briefly, I just got the end of it.
Yeah. So I said, do you believe that digital websites will gain the kind of trust that traditional platforms hold? Like there's a certain trust value attached to, let's say, The Economist or the New York Times or BBC, etc., right? So do you believe like an independent digital website can gain the same amount of trust anytime soon?
That's a really good question. And I think we ask about trust in general in different ways. And when you ask questions about trust, people basically say they trust television news most on the whole. And then they trust internet news sites second or third. So they trust them a bit less. And then you've got social media and others after that. So a lot of that is inherited. It comes from, trust comes from having used things for a long time, or a particular medium having been around for a long time. Actually, radio is the most trusted, actually, ahead of television. But I think we also ask about, do you trust BBC across different platforms? And we don't see much difference, really. So it partly depends how good that brand is at being able to express its brand across digital and television. People often don't make that distinction. They think of the BBC. So yes, I think in short, I think it is possible for a few large brands to have the same level of trust. The tricky bit is getting the same level of engagement within digital, and trust comes from people using it and valuing it enough. And I think that's the real problem with digital. So this problem of engagement is the real challenge right now.
So can I ask my question?
Yeah.
Ajay, you can go ahead.
Sir, so when we talk about reader revenue, does it also mean that news becomes elitist? For example, what about those who can't afford to pay? Does it put extra pressure on news organization to cater to the taste of the elite?
Yeah. So I think the old models, like advertising, also had a whole load of problems because the incentives were to produce content that made people click. So it didn't necessarily produce quality journalism. It produced, basically everyone had to produce the same thing, but produce it more quickly. So you got more mistakes and more sensationalism. So the advertising model wasn't great. The reader model, you're quite right, is going to push people towards some different things, some of which may be better, some of which may be worse. So I think it will push people to producing more quality journalism that is useful for audiences. But the danger is that other people will be missed out. And, you know, that's why I think we need some kind of mixed ecosystem. So in the UK, we have very strong public service broadcasting, which means that everybody is going to get high quality news. It's going to be available for free. And then on top of that, the other publications need to provide something of greater value to specific groups. And so that's kind of where we're seeing it. But in other countries, you don't have public service broadcasting. And I think you're right. What's going to happen then? Who's good? You know, is it right that people who can afford it get better quality news than people who don't? And and what does that mean for society? Does it mean that, you know, people who can't afford it will just get news that inflames the passions even further and increases polarization, and the elites get all the best information and therefore get richer? So yeah, I think there's a whole load of questions about information inequality, and hopefully the answer is some kind of mixed ecosystem and probably more government support for certain types of activities in journalism, I think.
Sir, doesn't it also mean that we have to step away from objectivity, because there is political leaning of when we cater to these people, there is always political leaning. So won't we be stepping away from objectivity and, as you said, focus on individual news?
I think that's the danger. So I mean, you may have seen the New York Times case where they commissioned an opinion piece from on the riots from a right-wing senator, I think, and they had to withdraw it because all these people were unsubscribing. All these liberals said, we don't want this anywhere near us, so just give us more of what we like and get rid of all that stuff. And I think that's really, made people question the reader model. Is that where we're heading? Basically into a world of media companies as echo chambers. But I don't know whether that means we have to abandon objectivity in news. That was really about opinion, but I don't think we should. But then that's me talking. I started my career in the BBC. What do you think? Do you think that objectivity is still important in journalism?
Sir, I think there's no level playing field anymore in India, especially. So
Yeah.
I think there needs to be we should step away from objectivity. At the same time, be neutral in the sense, don't cater to the such political parties. Rather, we should focus on human beings. We don't do that here in India anymore, I guess.
Right. Yeah. So that's kind of that's an interesting one. You know, just tell stories about human beings, but even in the selection of the stories you take and the spin you're putting on it, it's not necessarily neutral, right? You're taking a view about what you're doing. I mean, I think this, if we go down this route, I'm really worried about what happens to society. So I personally think this is a critical moment, and we need to reestablish the importance of objective, impartial journalism, certainly around news, whilst respecting that that news organizations, in their opinions, that's also important, right? And you can have a sort of left-leaning and right-leaning. But I think this mixing of, basically agendas, people hate agendas, right? They want news to say something, and they don't want a sort of false equivalent balance. It's a complicated issue, right? What do other people think on this issue?
Mayuri, you're up next.
Okay, actually, I have something to say regarding what Sir said about objective versus partial news. I think, at least I'm vehemently against falsification of news and using journalism as a tool for propaganda. But I also believe that having diverse points, diverse perspectives, helps in broadening the understanding of the readers, because if every news outlet reports the same kind of news and has the same perspective, I don't think that's conducive to
Right.
broadening of perspectives in general. So my question was, basically, I've done some homework on you, sir, and I know that you've pioneered the BBC News website. So I wanted to ask you about your recent work in digital innovation in journalism with interactive TV applications and such. Like, how do you see the landscape changing in digital news?
In terms of innovation, I'm actually so we did a number of things at the BBC. It started off in 1997 as we were one of the few digital news websites. And then I guess the innovation was around mobile. So we were some of the first to do mobile apps. Then we thought interactive TV was going to be the future. And I don't believe in interactive TV. I don't think, we tried a whole load of things. The BBC's actually closed down a lot of interactive TV services because the smartphone basically won, because it's just much more interactive to do something and more personal to do it on the smartphone. And you can even watch television programs. And if you just want to control it and put it to the television, you can do all that on your smartphone now and just control the television. So to me, the smartphone is the real revolution. I think if you think about innovation today, I think audio is really interesting. So the way in which audio is now being disrupted, both with podcasts and smart speakers, I think this is going to be a voice. I think this is going to be one of the next real disruptions. And I think this is where people should be thinking a lot more carefully, because it's such a fantastic medium, because you can do other things while you're listening. It's just amazing. I started my career in radio, and it's just amazing to find young people who never had radios discovering radio for the first time, discovering the power of spoken word audio for the first time. So I think we're going to see a lot of innovation in that space. And I think you had Charlie Beckett last week, right? And I think the whole area of AI, this is going to be something that really shapes what happens over the next decade as well. So if I was looking at innovation, those are the areas that I would look at most. Thanks for your question.
Thank you, sir.
Niladri?
Yeah, good morning, sir. I just wanted to ask, you talked about two approaches. One is the subscription model and the other is the philanthropy model. So we have Jeff Bezos on one hand and we have Warren Buffett on the other. But nevertheless, we understand that news is going to be polarized anyway. So is there any hope for neutral news, since we have the youth also being influenced and preferring polarized news, like the Telegraph in UK and the Guardian, poles apart?
Yeah, I mean, I think some of the models are not just about sort of big, Warren Buffett's. I really like the community model. So you have organizations like Texas Tribune. I showed you one from Bristol, which is basically the community itself, and so it's almost like a sort of collective, and it's fun. So people fund through donation. And that supports a news organization that represents the whole community. And I think in local, we have an opportunity to create something that is not polarized, because it has to represent the whole community, because the scale doesn't work otherwise. That's maybe a little bit different. I think the other models, obviously the BBC model, which is hugely under threat right now, across the world, so public media. But that's a model where it says, a basic level of, quality news, objective quality news, which is kind of regulated and has oversight and is responsible for everyone, ensuring that everyone gets a range of news. I think without that, we will slip into this sort of polarized world, which will in turn inflame societies and not be good for democracy. So I think the big debate is going to be about public intervention as well. So how do you use public money? So not just philanthropy and donation and subscription. It won't be enough. We're going to need some other kinds of interventions.
Thank you, sir.
Shruti? She's not around. Okay, Jyoti, you can go ahead.
Dave, she has some problems with her internet, so she wants you to ask her question. It's in the chat box.
Yeah. So Jyoti, you can.
Yes, sir.
Yeah.
Sir, I wanted to ask a question, building on the earlier question about the pitfalls of objectivity. We know that most mainstream media organizations, in the name of objectivity and transparency, end up inadvertently creating a false equivalence between both sides of the debate when it comes to climate change. And
Right.
we know that after the pandemic has broken up, there have been two trends. One is that there is an increasing need for objective information, and people are turning more towards mainstream media organizations. And at the same time, the reporting of climate change has come down. Some reports suggest it has come down by around 60%. So how does one negotiate that, like a reporter covering the climate beat, how does one cover that, especially when there is an emergency looming in terms of
Yeah.
climate?
So, I mean, it's a great question, but I think this false equivalence everyone always comes back to the climate change example, and I think people don't want false equivalence, right? They want, that's not what objectivity is. It's about understanding the different perspectives and then, as fairly as you can, explaining where the balance of scientific opinion lies. So it's not about, you know, giving equal time. And I think that, I'm not saying that that's not how it's been interpreted by organizations like the BBC in the past, and the BBC has done a lot of soul searching about that, is changing what it thinks about objectivity and how it is applied. But it's definitely not about balance between extreme views. And if it, and that is, you know, it may have happened in the past, but the BBC and others are really trying to think that through in different ways. So it's about balance over time, as opposed to necessarily within a particular broadcast. It's about really understanding the facts and presenting them fairly and neutrally without your personal biases as far as possible. And the BBC is going through a whole exercise right now about rethinking impartiality and objectivity. And then we'll come out with a discussion about that. But I think the fundamental principles are probably right. The way we've been interpreting them may be a little bit wrong.
Inian, yeah, you can go ahead.
So, like, my name is Inian. Like, you talked about attention and how do we keep the attention and how to add quality to it is the question. That's what you mentioned. Like, I want to know, like, in future, how do you see it? How do you see the attention of individuals, you know, like turning, and in what way we need to evolve to grab that attention?
Yeah, great question. I think it's absolutely the critical point. So I used to be a sort of a big evangelist for digital. I am a big evangelist for digital, always have been. And, you know, I thought digital would get a lot of attention. People really want to come to our websites and want to spend a lot of time with us. And the reality is they don't. They want to get in and out as quickly as possible. News is sort of something that they don't particularly enjoy. You know, they need to know things, and they want to do that as efficiently as they can so they can get on and watch the Netflix movie or whatever it is. So this problem of attention, I think, is partly a problem of the format. And actually, we probably need to recognize, you know, instead of trying to get more and more attention by being ever more sensationalist, I think down that route leads to ruin, and it leads to, you know, pollution of some of the ideals of journalism that we've talked about. I think we need to think much more carefully about the formats of journalism. And I think, you know, websites are kind of built for efficiency. They're not built for engagement necessarily. We can build more engaging experiences. We have to build more engaging experiences. And I guess that podcast is one example of that, right? People are spending, you know, 20, 30 minutes. They're really, I get immersed in a big story. I understand a huge amount when I've listened to a 25-minute podcast. It's digital, but I'm spending time with it. Whereas websites I'm in and out of. And I guess what I'm saying is we need to develop more formats like that really engage people and help, you know, great journalism that isn't purely in writing text on a web page.
Also, like, that quality get its own thing. Quality of the medium. Will it gain? Will the reader quality stuff? Reader go in search for it?
You're not audible.
Can you write that in the chat? Yeah,
Shruti, are you back? Shruti, are you back?
She's having connection issues. She asked someone to read out her question. It is in the chat. Shall I read it now?
Yes, please.
More number of stories or most read stories doesn't immediately result in more and more virtual subscriptions. How do we work on traffic and conversion?
Right. So, I mean, the difference with the reader model is that people don't subscribe based on the most popular story. So the most popular story is probably available everywhere, so people aren't going to subscribe to you. So they're interested in reading it, but that's not the distinctive thing that will make them subscribe. So in terms of subscription and conversion, most publishers who've been doing this have basically come up with the kinds of things that get people to subscribe, and it tends to be the stuff that you can't get anywhere else. It tends to be the quality, the exclusives, sometimes the opinions of the columnists. And so that's really the thing to work on, I think, is making your if you're going for a subscription model, you're using the other stuff to bring people in, but then you have to then display to them other things that are going to be converting. So it's really about understanding more about your data, understanding more about what your audiences want and what they're willing to pay for, producing more of that, and then working out how you get the funnel in so that you get people out at the other end who are prepared to subscribe and believe in what you do.
Yeah, can we take one more question? Can you take one more question? Right?
Indian posted this question.
Yeah, it's in the chat.
Do I believe that the quality of work can find its place in the midst of this attention-seeking models? Yes, I think it can. I mean, what I'm currently seeing is that in many countries you will have one or two quality players who do really well. So if we just look at what the New York Times has achieved, they've achieved it by investing in journalism, investing in quality journalism. They have 6 million subscribers, and they're currently, are the most successful media company in the world. Look at the Guardian in the UK. I would argue is pretty similar. It's invested in quality content and quality journalism, and they have a different model which is based on donation, but it's the same basic principle. So yes, I do think, and then there are many examples of niche publications, maybe one person, two people, a small group of people who are doing something that is deeply valuable to a few people. So I think we're going to see more of those, and I think those things are going to be rewarded. But we're also seeing a whole load of duplicative, sensationalized journalism or polarizing journalism, and that is undermining the whole trust in journalism, and it's also pushing society apart quite often.
Thank you so much, Nick. It's been a wonderful session, and it's been very educative and informative, and thank you so much for having making time for us.
Pleasure.
It's been wonderful.
Good luck to good luck to all of you in your studies and in your journalism. It's much needed to have great journalists with good training.
Can I share your presentation with them?
Sure, of course. Yeah.
No. Thank you so much. Yeah. Have a nice day. Yeah.
Bye. Dave, don't worry.
Yeah, sure. Okay. Thank you. Thank you so much. Bye-bye.
Thanks a lot.
Cheers.